The wind off the Pembrokeshire coast screamed like a living thing, slipping through arrow slits and rattling rushes across the stone floor. In a small chamber at Pembroke Castle, the fire hissed but gave little warmth. There, on a pallet piled with linen and prayer, a 13-year-old girl clutched the blood-wet sheets and bit down on a strip of leather to keep from breaking her own teeth. Margaret Beaufort, child, widow, heir to old Lancastrian blood, labored in the deep midwinter of 1457, with a body not yet finished growing, and a life that had already learned fear. Midwives moved with rough tenderness, their hands stained with herbs and ash. Latin prayers tangled with Welsh whispers, a relic touched to the brow. Rosemary thrown on the coals to sweeten air thick with iron and sweat. Sancta Margareta, ora pro nobis, someone breathed, invoking the saint who, legend promised, burst from the belly of a dragon and lived. A candle guttered and flared back, as if the room itself refused to let darkness win. Every contraction tore at her like a mailed fist. The older women had seen this before. A noble girl made a vessel long before she was a woman. They shifted her hips, changed her position, pressed warm cloths to trembling thighs. Outside, the walls boomed with winter surf. Inside, time narrowed to the length of a breath. Margaret's hair, dark and matted, stuck to her temples. Between waves of pain she mouthed the Pater Noster, bargaining with God and the only coin she possessed, endurance. They feared the worst. A child birthing a child often meant 2 deaths and a silence afterward that no relic could mend. Yet something flinty had taken root in her grit, born of long months of dread and devotional discipline. She obeyed every command, clung to whispered promises that saints attend the young and the broken, that suffering could be hammered into purpose. When the final agony came, it was like the castle itself cracked. A thin, outraged cry sliced the smoky air. For an instant, everyone forgot to breathe. Then movement swift, practiced clearing the tiny mouth, rubbing a bluish back, lifting a slick, stubborn life toward the firelight. The midwife placed the swaddled infant upon Margaret's chest for a heartbeat's benediction. She stared astonished, fever-bright at the small face that had nearly cost her everything. Snow drifted past the slit windows. Word would travel slowly through frozen lanes and hostile roads, but it would travel. In this battered fortress on the edge of the sea, a Tudor boy had entered the world. Those present felt it without daring to say it aloud, the sense that history had just changed its direction in a low, smoke-stained room where a child became a mother, and pain became prophecy. The cry of the newborn still echoed in Margaret's ears when silence reclaimed the chamber. She lived, but only just, her body shattered by the ordeal. In that fragile pause between life and death, her lineage became her shield and burden. Margaret Beaufort was not simply any girl plucked from obscurity. She carried within her veins the blood of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, 4th son of Edward III. This ancient thread tied her to the throne of England, a connection that was both treasure and curse in a kingdom soon to be torn apart by civil war. Her story began long before the shrieks of Pembroke Castle. In May 1443, Margaret was born into the turbulent household of John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and Margaret Beauchamp of Bletsoe. From the moment of her birth, her destiny was not her own. Her father was a soldier in a losing war, sent to France to salvage England's fading empire during the closing years of the 100 Years' War. He returned home, hollow-eyed, broken by defeat, the shadow of disgrace hanging heavy over him. In May 1444, when Margaret was barely 1 year old, John Beaufort was found dead. The official cause was fever. Yet whispers spread like wildfire, through Noble Hall's poison perhaps, or his own hand ending the shame of failure. In the 15th century, every sudden noble death drew suspicions of foul play, as natural causes were rarely believed, in a world where daggers and cups of wine served political ends as often as swords. That mystery of her father's death stained Margaret's early years like an invisible shroud. She grew up hearing fragments of stories, of campaigns lost in Normandy, of castles surrendered, of a commander who watched Henry V's victories crumble into dust. To some, her father was a man destroyed by bad fortune. To others, he was weak, too frail for the brutal demands of kingship and war. For Margaret, it meant being the daughter of a disgraced duke, his legacy hanging around her neck like a chain she could neither remove nor ignore. But in a world where names were currency, even a tarnished one carried value. The Beaufort line itself, was a complicated inheritance descendants of John of Gaunt and his mistress-turned-wife, Catherine Swynford. Their children had been legitimized by royal decree, yet a stain of illegitimacy clung stubbornly, like a mark that no parchment could erase. This duality, royal blood yet questioned birthright, would follow Margaret all her life, making her both indispensable and suspect in equal measure. By the time she could walk the gardens of Bletsoe, Margaret was already a pawn on England's political chessboard. She did not yet know it, but her blood marked her out as a prize worth capturing and as a threat worth extinguishing. In 15th century England, noble birth was not a blessing freely enjoyed, but a dangerous inheritance, as likely to lead to a crown as to the scaffold. By the age of 6, Margaret Beaufort had already been promised away like coin in a bargain. Her mother, the widowed Margaret Beauchamp, understood too well the brutal calculus of noble survival. Daughters were not children to be cherished, but bridges to alliances. Thus, little Margaret was betrothed to John de la Pole, son of the Duke of Suffolk, one of the most powerful men in England. The match bound her fragile future to Suffolk's towering influence. For a moment, it seemed an unshakable alliance. But in the shifting sands of English politics, stability never lasted long. In 1450, the Duke of Suffolk fell spectacularly from grace, accused of treason after brokering the unpopular marriage between Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou. Suffolk's enemies seized him at sea. His end was grotesque, hacked apart with a rusty sword, each botched blow a symbol of the kingdom's savagery. With his death, the carefully inked betrothal vanished like parchment cast into a fire. Margaret, not yet a teenager, learned the first of many harsh lessons. A girl's worth was as fragile as the men who claimed her. But England was still eager to bind itself to her bloodline. Barely into her 12th year, Margaret was married to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, half-brother to King Henry VI. The Tudors were upstarts Welsh-born, of questionable legitimacy, but newly risen by royal favor. Owen Tudor, their patriarch, had dared to wed Catherine of Valois, the widowed queen of Henry V, scandalizing the nobility and embedding Welsh blood into the English throne's foundations. Now, through Edmund's marriage to Margaret, royal legitimacy and political ambition intertwined in a web that neither bride nor groom could fully grasp. The wedding itself, held at Bletsoe Castle, was steeped in ceremony Margaret could hardly comprehend. She wore silks embroidered with her family's arms. She knelt before an altar where her grandfather's tomb loomed, silent reminder of lineage and mortality. But Margaret was scarcely past childhood games in the castle gardens. Her new husband, a man in his 20s, hardened by war and politics, stood as her future, her master, her fate. That night, the vows were not only spoken but consummated. There was no mercy for youth and noble marriages. Margaret's body, unready, became a battlefield for dynastic ambition. The trauma was profound, leaving scars invisible yet enduring. Later in life, she would turn with ferocity toward faith, devotion becoming both shield and outlet for suffering too dangerous to name. For Margaret, obedience was demanded, silence expected, but within her small breaking body, the seeds of steel were being forged. In the eyes of England, she was no longer a child but a vessel for Tudor hopes, for Lancaster's survival, for the continuation of bloodlines that had already drowned the realm in whispers of treason and war. The marriage to Edmund Tudor was brief, but it reshaped Margaret's life with brutal swiftness. Not a year into their union, the realm convulsed with violence. The Wars of the Roses, still in its infancy, was already tearing at England's fragile seams. Edmund, loyal to the Lancastrian king, rode into Wales to secure territory against the rising Yorkist threat. Margaret, scarcely 13 and heavy with child, remained behind, her husband's absence stretching into dread. In November 1456, news came like a thunderclap. Edmund had been captured at Carmarthen Castle. The accounts of his death that followed were cloaked in suspicion. Some whispered he succumbed to plague, the common explanation offered whenever captives died too conveniently. Others murmured of betrayal, a knife in the dark, or quiet murder at the hands of Yorkist enemies eager to extinguish a royal half-brother without stirring scandal. What is certain is that before Margaret had reached her 14th birthday, she was a widow, her husband's fate sealed in the shadows of civil war. Pregnant, bereft, and politically exposed, she was placed under the guardianship of Jasper Tudor, Edmund's younger brother. Jasper was not merely acting from duty, he recognized what Margaret carried within her. The unborn child represented the continuation of the Tudor claim, a living piece of Lancaster's fragile future. For Margaret, his protection was both salvation and a cage. The journey from Carmarthen to Jasper's fortress at Pembroke was an ordeal in itself. It was winter. The roads were half-frozen swamps, rutted with mud and treacherous with ice. Margaret traveled by litter, her swollen body jolted with every turn, every stone, every pothole. Servants trudged alongside through sleet and snow, while armed escorts scanned the bleak countryside for roaming bands of soldiers who owed allegiance to no king but their own swords. Each night, she lay in strange chambers, barns, monasteries, the cold guest halls of sympathetic nobles, her prayers thick with terror that her child would not survive the journey. At last, the walls of Pembroke rose before her, a towering fortress carved from limestone, perched on cliffs above the restless sea. Its round keep loomed against the gray sky, unyielding as the wars tearing England apart. For centuries, it had withstood storm and siege, a bastion at the edge of the known world. Now it became Margaret's refuge, though comfort was scarce. Inside, the castle was cold and austere, its drafty corridors lined with tapestries too thin to keep out the sea wind. The chambers smelled of salt and damp stone. Yet within these walls, Margaret's fate and the fate of her unborn child would soon be decided. In the silence of Pembroke, as the snow piled deep outside and war brewed across England, the girl of 13 prepared to endure the most harrowing trial of her young life. Winter tightened its grip on Pembroke, and with it came the slow, terrifying approach of Margaret's confinement. The castle physician, Dr. Lewis of Caerleon, studied her slight frame with deepening concern. Her hips were narrow, her body unfinished, and the child within her grew restless, positioned badly. He confided to Jasper Tudor in low tones that there was little hope. Nature was demanding from Margaret what nature had not yet given her, a woman's body strong enough to bear life. When her labor began in January 1457, it was sudden and merciless. A sharp contraction seized her as she walked the battlements for strength, and within moments, she was doubled over, carried back to her chamber by her attendants. The midwives, women seasoned by decades of births, exchanged looks that needed no words. They knew the dangers of a child giving birth to a child. The chamber filled with ritual and desperation. Lavender burned to calm her, rosemary to fortify her. Relics of saints were pressed into her trembling hands. Candles flickered against stone walls, their glow mingling with the acrid smoke of herbs. Outside, the sea wind howled through arrow slits, and within, Margaret's cries rose and fell, until her voice broke into hoarse gasps. The midwives whispered prayers to Saint Margaret of Antioch, patroness of women in labor, their chants a fragile shield against the dark. Hours dragged into night, and night blurred toward dawn. For 18 hours, Margaret endured agony that bent the line between life and death. Midwives shifted her body, massaged her belly, coaxed her with murmured encouragement. Dame Gwen, the eldest among them, worked with relentless calm, her hands steady even as blood slicked her palms. Jasper Tudor paced outside, each scream of his young sister-in-law striking him like a blade. He knew the child she carried was not just his nephew, it was Lancaster's last fragile hope. At the final hour, silence fell. Margaret's body seemed to give way, collapsing under pain too great to name. The decision was made, manual intervention, dangerous but unavoidable. Dame Gwen reached inside with practiced hands, whispering invocations as she worked. The room held its breath. Then, after a moment that felt eternal, a sound pierced the chamber, the thin, defiant wail of a newborn. Henry Tudor had entered the world, bloodied and fragile but alive. He was placed briefly upon Margaret's chest, his tiny body warming against her as her fevered eyes drank in the sight. She had given England its future king, but the price was carved deep into her flesh. The tearing and internal damage left her broken, never to bear another child. At 13, Margaret was both a mother and barren, her body sacrificed on the altar of dynastic ambition. As the child was carried to the fire to be swaddled, Margaret drifted on the edge of consciousness, torn between triumph and despair. She had survived, but only just. And from her suffering, a dynasty had begun. Stop! Margaret's body healed slowly, but never fully. The birth had left her scarred, Her capacity for children ended before it had begun. At 13, she was both a mother and, in the eyes of the world, a widow with a dangerous treasure, a living son of Lancaster blood. She clung to Henry with a devotion sharpened by pain, though their bond was shadowed by circumstance. In that fragile infant lay not only her future, but the hopes of a faction already stumbling into open war. Jasper Tudor, ever vigilant, understood that Pembroke could not shelter them forever. England itself was unraveling. The Wars of the Roses erupted in earnest in 1455, when the White Rose of York clashed with the Red Rose of Lancaster. At St. Albans, noble blood stained the streets, and the fragile king, Henry VI, revealed himself as unfit to command. Margaret, confined to her recovery, felt the tremors of the conflict ripple through her existence. Her son's survival, she quickly grasped, was both his birthright and his peril. By 1458, she was married again, this time to Sir Henry Stafford, the younger son of the Duke of Buckingham. It was not a marriage of romance but of survival, a calculated alliance negotiated by her mother. Stafford was pragmatic, with Yorkist sympathies, but also shrewd enough to recognize the value in protecting Beaufort estates and the Lancastrian heir Margaret had delivered. For her, it was a bitter compromise. Yet protection, however cold, was better than exposure in a kingdom where noble blood could be a death sentence. The years that followed hardened Margaret further. She managed her estates with precision, learning the art of balancing accounts, negotiating with tenants, and extracting loyalty in an age where loyalty was fragile. While men slaughtered one another at Towton, the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil, Margaret navigated politics with ink and whispered words. Her strength was not on the battlefield, but in survival, cultivating allies, avoiding ruin, and safeguarding her son's inheritance even from afar. But Henry was not by her side. Under Jasper's guardianship, the boy grew up in Wales, a stranger to the mother who had nearly died to bring him into the world. Margaret saw him rarely, sometimes only once a year. Each meeting was a tangle of joy and grief, a fleeting reminder of what she had lost. She poured her love into letters and prayers, imagining him growing strong across the water while she maneuvered through England's treacherous courts. Her piety deepened during these years, not as passive retreat, but as armor. Hours of prayer, bleeding knees before stone altars, memorized psalms, each ritual became a way to transmute suffering into strength. To her attendants, it seemed an obsession. To Margaret, it was survival, a discipline as sharp as any sword. Faith, estates, and political caution, these were her weapons. And though she appeared subdued, even humble, beneath that quiet exterior burned a resolve as unyielding as Pembroke's limestone walls. The year 1471 shattered what remained of Margaret's fragile peace. The Lancastrian cause bled out at Tewkesbury, where Edward of Westminster, the last Prince of Lancaster, was struck down. Soon after, Henry VI himself was quietly disposed of in the Tower. In a single stroke, Margaret's young son Henry Tudor, barely 14, became the focus of a dynasty's desperate hopes. That made him valuable, but it also made him a target. Jasper Tudor, sensing the noose tightening, spirited the boy across the sea to Brittany. Their flight was hasty, pursued by Yorkist soldiers, and when the ship's sails finally vanished into the mist, Margaret was left behind, her heart broken, her son torn from her arms by necessity and survival. Exile changed everything. Henry was beyond her reach now, separated by the treacherous waters of the Channel and the hostility of nations. Yet Margaret did not collapse under grief. She transformed it. The soft-faced girl who had once knelt bleeding at a birthing bed became steel, her mourning reshaped into cold ambition. If she could not cradle her son, she would build him a throne. Her second husband, Henry Stafford, died that same year. Once more, Margaret stood widowed, but she did not linger in vulnerability. Instead, she sought out power with clear-eyed precision. Her third marriage was not for comfort, nor for sentiment, but for strategy. She wed Thomas Stanley, Lord Stanley, a man infamous for his political dexterity. Stanley was a master of survival, a noble who bent with the wind of fortune, always managing to land on the winning side. To some he was a turncoat, to others a genius of self-preservation. To Margaret, he was the partner she needed, a man whose vast influence and private armies could shield her son's claim. It was in this union that Margaret became more than survivor. She became conspirator, strategist, architect of rebellion. From her household, she began weaving threads of loyalty across England. Merchants carried messages disguised as business contracts. Priests bore coded letters stitched into their robes. Commoners whispered rumors planted at her command. She cultivated friendships with women in noble households, understanding that kitchens and sewing chambers often carried secrets more potent than any council hall. Meanwhile, in Brittany, Henry Tudor was growing into manhood under Jasper's watchful eye. He learned diplomacy, the delicate balancing act of exile, and the patience of a claimant who could not yet claim. Letters passed between mother and son, layered in code, brief and cautious, but pulsing with longing and purpose. Margaret's world revolved around these fragile missives, everyone a lifeline tying her to the boy she had nearly died to bear. By the late 1470s, Margaret Beaufort was no longer the quiet, pious widow history might have expected her to become. She was a player in England's deadly game of thrones, moving silently, watching endlessly, waiting for her chance. To outward eyes she was a dutiful wife to Lord Stanley, a devout matron. But beneath the veil of humility, she was already plotting the restoration of Lancaster through her son, through Henry Tudor. And she would not rest until the crown was within his grasp. Richard III's rise to power in 1483 cracked open England's fragile order. The disappearance of the young princes in the Tower Edward V and his brother Richard sent shockwaves across the realm. Whispers turned to certainty. The usurper had murdered children to seize the crown. In that vacuum of legitimacy, Margaret Beaufort saw opportunity. Her son's distant claim, once fragile, suddenly gleamed brighter against the stain on Yorkist honor. Henry Tudor, exiled in Brittany, became a beacon for those disillusioned by Richard's brutality. Margaret acted with audacity that astonished even her allies. She coordinated with Bishop John Morton and other conspirators, arranging for uprisings in England to coincide with her son's invasion. Money was raised, ships secured, coded letters dispatched across seas and into castles. She gambled everything, even while under Richard's suspicion. Caught in conspiracy, she was placed under house arrest, her estates threatened, her every move watched. Yet even confinement did not silence her. Servants loyal to her smuggled letters in hollowed-out loaves of bread or beneath layers of wax on wax-sealed messages. Richard may have caged her body, but he never bound her will. For 2 years, she maneuvered in shadows. Every setback failed rebellions, betrayals, Henry's delayed invasions, she absorbed and transformed into fresh resolve. Each risk carried the weight of death, yet Margaret pressed on, her devotion to her son transmuted into near-religious mission. She had not survived childbirth at 13, widowhood twice, and years of political storms merely to fade into obscurity. Then, in August 1485, her gamble came due. Henry Tudor landed at Milford Haven, the same Welsh coast where Margaret had labored to bring him into the world 28 years earlier. It was as though destiny had called him home. He marched inland, gathering support, while Richard III prepared his forces for the decisive clash. At Bosworth Field, the fate of England turned on a heartbeat. The Stanley forces, commanded by Margaret's own husband, held back as the armies clashed. Richard fought like a lion, charging directly at Henry himself. But in the final desperate moment, the Stanleys turned, not for Richard, but for Margaret's son. Their betrayal sealed Richard's doom. He fell in the mud, crying treason, as the crown rolled from his brow. Henry Tudor was lifted high as king, and Margaret Beaufort's lifelong gamble bore its fruit. She, once a child screaming in a birthing chamber, now stood as my lady the king's mother, the matriarch of a dynasty. Through her iron will, her patience, and her sacrifices, she had ended decades of civil war and founded the Tudor line that would reshape England and the world. Yet the cost was immense. Margaret had surrendered her body, her youth, her motherhood itself. She had lived apart from her son more than she had lived with him. What bound them was not tenderness, but survival and ambition. In Westminster Abbey, her tomb speaks in Latin of piety and power, but no stone can capture the echo of that first scream in Pembroke Castle. From agony had come an empire. From a girl's suffering had risen a queen mother, whose shadow would stretch across centuries.